Well, good afternoon once again. What a joy it is to share these 3 weeks just shy and with you on the subject of leadership and looking at different biblical models. This week we've been looking at the biblical character of Joseph and the law of process. The law of process reminds us that leadership develops daily, not in a day. So this is a long-term thing. It's not a short one-time shot, but it's an everyday situation. So as we do every single day, we start with a thought for the day, a leadership thought for today. We've looked at how it takes God's it takes trials, it takes time to grow as a leader. Today, our thought is that it takes God's help to grow as a leader. So time, trials, and God's help. And this certainly applies to our subject of this week, our example, and that is Joseph. And so I want you to consider, as we introduce today, Joseph on a journey from the pit to the palace. Thing about his life, when his brothers forcibly threw him in a pit, originally with the idea of killing him, and everything that transpired, and then the story ends with him in the palace, second in command of the most powerful country on earth at that time. And what a journey that was. And we've been looking at how that happened and looking at that process. And going back to the law of process, that happened daily. It didn't happen in a day. When Joseph had his dreams, he was 17 years old, and now we find that he had become 30 years old when he met Pharaoh. So 13 years then had intervened, and that's where Joseph learned his lessons. So like most great leaders, Joseph labored in obscurity for a season of his life before he became qualified to lead others. That's such an important thing to consider. Sometimes what we do is behind the scenes, but that's what fashions us. That's what molds us. That's what equips us. When the spotlight's not on us, that's what puts us in the position later on to be at the front, so to speak. So it's during this period that God most often works to prepare a potential leader. Nearly 23 years passed from the pit to the palace before Joseph was reunited with his brothers and his own vision was fulfilled. But by then, he had come to learn that true progress occurs only when God orchestrates it. And that's from page 45 of the book, 21 Most Powerful Minutes in a Leader's Day. Again, I urge you all, go out and pick it up. It's the background to what we've been studying, and it would help fill in some gaps in what we're able to do here on the video. So encourage you to pick that up. So today we want to talk about another kind of journey. We already mentioned from pit to palace, but here today we're going to spend some time looking at self-promotion versus divine promotion. You see, self-promotion can never accomplish what divine promotion can. So let's look at Joseph as a prime example, exhibit A, if you will, for you lawyer types or you like lawyer shows. Exhibit A. Joseph tried self-promotion on his brothers. We know by now where that got him. Remember that it was during his time with Potiphar as a slave that Joseph first gained the sense that God was orchestrating his success. So when he was Jacob's favorite, when he enjoyed rubbing it into his brothers, when he enjoyed that status, he didn't have a sense that God was with him. It's not saying that God didn't, but Joseph didn't seem to either care or know that God was orchestrating his success. But it was when he was a slave, when he was a servant, that's when Joseph gained an understanding that God was behind it all. And you begin to see in the text that we've been looking at that Joseph begins attributing his successes to the Lord. Now, there's also a second example, not quite as demonstrative as what he did with his brothers when he was younger, but he went back to a certain degree to self-promotion when he asked the chief butler to remember him and basically put in a good word with Pharaoh. Of course, what happened, we know, is that the butler, having been extricated from his predicament, immediately forgot about Joseph. And we find that Joseph languished in the prison for 2 more years until the time that Pharaoh had his dream. And so self-promotion can get us into problems because it's all about us. Now, contrast that to the second part of this, and that is from self-promotion to divine promotion. Joseph finally learned his lesson during these 2 additional years in prison. He now understood that God had given him a dream about his destiny, and perhaps more importantly, that since God had given him that dream, that God was then responsible to see it come to fruition. So God brought Joseph's destiny out into the open by giving Pharaoh dreams that neither he nor his advisors could even understand, let alone interpret their significance. So Joseph had absolutely nothing to do with Pharaoh getting those dreams. He couldn't have manufactured it. He couldn't have said, well, I had a dream. The butler and the baker had a dream. Let's see if I can talk Pharaoh into having a dream. It doesn't work that way. So Joseph could not have done anything whatsoever to cause Pharaoh to have a dream. God, however, is not restricted like that. And in fact, God did in fact cause Pharaoh to have these dreams. And so Pharaoh tries to call his advisors and none of them can figure it out. And then all of a sudden, seemingly just by coincidence, but we know it wasn't, the butler says, oh, I remember a couple of years ago when I was in prison, there was this Hebrew slave who was there, and I had a dream, and the baker had a dream. And you know what, Pharaoh, both of us, he told both of us our dreams and their interpretation, and both of them came true exactly. And so Pharaoh says, well, go get him. What are you waiting for? Now, what's interesting is that since Joseph had now learned his lesson, what he said when Pharaoh said, I heard you can interpret dreams. Because what Joseph did is that he acknowledged in front of Pharaoh and his officials that it was God who would interpret the dream, not him. So he wasn't promoting himself. He was, in essence, promoting God. And of course, Joseph then interpreted the dream with God's help. Now, in addition to gaining a sense of God promotion, not worrying anymore, and think about it, isn't it so much less stressful to not have to promote yourself? Isn't it so much better to let God do it for us? That's just an extra thought thrown in at no extra charge. But in addition to this sense of God promotion, Joseph also gained a God-centered perspective. You see, Joseph originally thought that his brothers and even his parents bowing down to him was somehow a reflection on him. I must be good, or I must be smart, or I must be something or other, but it must be because of me. That's why they're going to bow down to me. I must be something great. Now, fast forward, following the death of his father, Joseph realized that his leadership role was not at all a reflection on him, but rather a reflection on God, who used Joseph, to be sure, to save the lives of many people. Furthermore, Joseph acknowledged that what his brothers meant for evil, God meant for good. Of course, that's in Genesis chapter 50, verses 19 and 20. isn't it interesting that it took all these things we talked about yesterday, the unfair criticism, the false accusation, the time languishing in prison, that finally woke Joseph up to the destiny that God had for him. And finally, he got it, and he acknowledges to his brothers just some amazing things. So let's look at that for a second. Because not only did he gain a God perspective, but he also gained an eternal perspective. Joseph could now trace God's hand through his entire life. And he understood God's long-term plan for his people and his role in that plan. Listen to what he says at the age of 110. And that's when he died. Right before he died, he told his family, "I am dying, but God will surely visit you to bring you out of this land and to the land of which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." So he understood how God had impacted his life and how he intended to help future generations. Sometimes it's good to sit back and to realize that it's not just about us, that we're not the center of things, but that our lives and our destiny and what we do to add value to people and to lift people up, that it's part of a bigger picture that we fit into. And Joseph came to this conclusion. He realized that the people of Israel had to be saved as a people, and they had to be assembled there in order to eventually get back to the promised land, that their destiny was not in Egypt. So he says to them, "I want you to make sure when he's on his deathbed, I want you to make sure that you take my bones back to the promised land. Don't leave me here." Because he realized that his life was a part of a much, much bigger plan. Same with us. So it brings us to our question for the day. Every day we have a new question for you to think about. And that is simply this: how has God helped you as a leader? Could be in small ways, could be in big ways, significant ways, maybe ways you haven't even thought about before now. But I invite you and encourage you to consider today, how has God helped you as a leader? Tomorrow, again, we'll gather at 1:30, not 3:30, that being Friday. And we look forward to bringing this week to a close before we move on next week to a new topic and a new biblical leader. For now, we wish you God's best and just believe great things for you. Thank you. We'll see you tomorrow.